Greenhorn was the kind of town that seemed almost out of place in a world that moved too fast. Nestled between rolling hills and the sprawling forests of Vermont, it was a place where people still trusted their neighbors, where doors remained unlocked, and secrets didn't stay hidden for long. It was a bohemian haven, attracting artists, writers, and free spirits from all walks of life who wanted a quieter, more connected way of living. Joan Watson was, in many ways, the heart of Greenhorn. Her petite figure moved gracefully through the weekly farmers' market, her laughter echoing as she greeted familiar faces. Joan had a warmth that made her magnetic. Her generosity and kindness were not just traits but a way of life. Her little shop, Joan's Crystals and Curios, was a sanctuary for townsfolk in search of guidance, healing, or just a cup of herbal tea. Joan believed deeply in energies, crystals, and natural remedies, and she wasn't afraid to share that passion with anyone who stepped through her doors. Locals admired her for her open heart and believed her to be an essential part of Greenhorn's unique charm. Living with Joan was her husband, John Morton, a man who appeared at first to be an ideal partner. They had met in their late 30s, both at a point in life where they were searching for stability and meaning. John had been a charming, steadfast presence in Joan's life, his calm demeanor grounding her free-spirited nature. He was good with his hands and had fixed up their quaint home with meticulous care, even installing a small garden for Joan to grow her herbs and flowers. Joan's daughter, Tiffany, from her first marriage, lived with them as well. Tiffany was the light of Joan's life, a 17-year-old with her mother's curious spirit and her father's quiet resolve. Though Tiffany had lost her biological father at a young age, she and Joan had formed a bond that went beyond mere mother-daughter connection. It was as if they understood each other's souls, intuitively attuned to each other's thoughts and emotions. She had an easy relationship with John, though it never quite reached the level of warmth she shared with her mother. He was the only father figure she'd known for years, and she respected him but was wary of his reserved nature. Yet, despite her idyllic surroundings, Joan began to notice subtle cracks in her life with John. Small things at first, an odd look in his eyes, moments when he seemed distracted or lost in thought. There were late nights at work that were growing more frequent, his cell phone constantly locked and tucked away in his pocket. Joan dismissed these things, telling herself it was just the wear and tear of married life, a natural part of getting older and settling down. John had always been a private man, one who kept his emotions to himself, so she tried not to pry. However, things began to shift noticeably around the time Tiffany entered her final year of high school. John became protective of her in a way that went beyond normal paternal concern. He questioned her curfews, showed discomfort around her friends, and often seemed to hover when she was around. Tiffany, uncomfortable with her stepfather's new behavior, began avoiding him whenever possible, seeking refuge in the comfort of her mother or the company of friends. Joan sensed the growing tension but chalked it up to Tiffany's teenage angst, never imagining anything darker lay beneath. One evening, Joan gathered her small family for a quiet dinner. She had cooked one of John's favorites, rosemary chicken with roasted vegetables, hoping to ease whatever strain seemed to be tugging at their family seams. As they sat around the table, she noticed John barely touched his food, his gaze fixated on Tiffany with a strange intensity. Tiffany shifted uncomfortably under his stare, her eyes darting to her mother with a silent plea. Joan, sensing the discomfort, attempted to steer the conversation, asking about Tiffany's school projects and plans for college. But John seemed uninterested, lost in a world of his own. Days turned into weeks, and Joan felt her carefully constructed life slipping further from her grasp. One particularly cold winter morning, she found herself confiding in her best friend, Emily Garrett, who had been her confidant for years. Emily listened intently, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. As Joan recounted her suspicions and the unspoken tension brewing at home, Emily offered comforting words, though there was a strange glint in her eye that Joan couldn't quite place. Emily assured her that every marriage had its moments of discord, that John was probably just going through a phase, and that Tiffany would eventually understand his protectiveness. Joan tried to take Emily's advice to heart, to believe that her worries were simply manifestations of stress or paranoia. She wanted to believe that her life, her marriage, and her family were still intact. But as she watched John withdraw further, becoming a ghostly shadow of the man she had married, a seed of doubt took root in her heart. She began to question everything she thought she knew, the faintest whisper of fear beginning to curl around her like a vine she couldn't shake. As winter turned into spring, Joan decided to confront John directly. They sat across from each other in the dimly lit living room, a small fire crackling in the hearth. Joan looked him squarely in the eyes and asked him about the distance, the secrecy, the strange glances he threw in Tiffany's direction. John's reaction was colder than the winter chill that lingered outside. He dismissed her concerns with a hollow laugh, brushing off her questions as nonsense. His casual dismissal stung, and she felt a wave of frustration and confusion. Who was this man she had let into her life, into her daughter's life? In the days that followed, Joan couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, irrevocably wrong. She kept up appearances, hoping that whatever was festering beneath the surface would simply disappear. Little did she know, the very ground she stood on was about to shatter beneath her feet. It was an unremarkable Tuesday morning when Tiffany's scream shattered the early quiet of Greenhorn. The sound pierced the neighborhood, sending a ripple of dread through the sleepy community. Inside the Watson Morton home, Tiffany's trembling hand covered her mouth as she backed away from the lifeless form of her mother, sprawled across the kitchen floor. Joan lay still, her once bright and warm eyes closed forever. The herbal tea she'd brewed was now cold on the counter, its fragrance mingling with the strange, sharp odor of something metallic and foreign. Tiffany's hands shook as she fumbled for her phone to dial emergency services. Her voice barely a whisper, she managed to stammer out the details, feeling numb as the weight of the scene settled over her. Within minutes, paramedics arrived, along with a police officer who immediately recognized the address and began asking questions. But it was Detective Patrick Mallory, a long-serving member of the Greenhorn Police Department, who would ultimately take charge of the case. Detective Patrick was well respected in Greenhorn, known for his quiet tenacity and meticulous approach to his work. In a town where crime was limited to the occasional petty theft or teenage prank, his experience with more sinister cases made him stand out. As he walked into the house, he was struck by the sense of peace that still lingered, despite the tragic discovery. After a brief conversation with Tiffany, who was now sitting on the porch wrapped in a blanket, Detective Patrick took his first look at Joan's body. At first glance, her death appeared accidental, perhaps a sudden health issue or a tragic misstep. But as he moved closer, noting the peculiar scent in the room and Joan's contorted expression, something deep within him stirred. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and at that moment, his gut told him that this was no accident. The preliminary autopsy report would confirm his suspicions. Joan's death was caused by cyanide poisoning, a rare and chilling method that pointed to deliberate intent. Cyanide was not the kind of substance one stumbled upon accidentally. Its presence meant someone had planned for Joan to die. As Patrick began his investigation, he quickly uncovered small, unsettling details that painted a picture of a marriage strained by secrecy and tension. He found traces of discord between John and Joan, confirmed by interviews with friends and neighbors. Some neighbors hinted at John's protective, almost possessive attitude toward Tiffany, a behavior that Joan had confided in her close friend Emily just weeks before her death. Others spoke of Joan's growing discomfort with John's increasingly erratic behavior, her desire to keep peace at home clashing with her instinct to protect her daughter. When Patrick questioned John, he found the man oddly calm, his responses measured and seemingly devoid of grief. John explained that he had been out early that morning, claiming he'd gone on a routine drive to pick up building supplies for a project he was working on. His alibi, while plausible, felt thin, especially since he could provide no receipts or tangible evidence of his trip. Detective Patrick's next step was to interview Emily Garrett. She had known Joan for years, and her closeness to Joan suggested she might have valuable insight. Emily seemed distraught as she recounted Joan's recent worries, mentioning John's distant behavior and Joan's growing suspicions. Then, with a hesitant look, Emily revealed something shocking: she and John had been involved in an affair for over a year. Her confession cast an unexpected light on the situation, adding a layer of betrayal and deceit to an already grim case. Emily claimed that while she had been romantically involved with John, she had nothing to do with Joan's death. According to her, their affair had been more of an escape for both of them, a release from the tensions within their respective lives. She insisted that John had always spoken fondly of Joan, albeit in a somewhat detached way, as though he regarded her as more of a responsibility than a partner. Despite Emily's tearful explanations, Detective Patrick couldn't ignore the possibility that her involvement went deeper. He ordered a check on Emily's whereabouts on the morning of Joan's death, hoping to either confirm her alibi or expose another layer to the mystery. While Emily's alibi held up, the revelation of their affair left Patrick with a gnawing sense that John's involvement in Joan's life, and her death, was far from innocent. As the investigation progressed, the pieces started to fall into place. Forensic tests revealed the shocking presence of cyanide on the rim of a Pepsi can Joan had been drinking from, a detail that pointed to premeditation. This discovery led Patrick to re-examine every detail of John's behavior in recent months, particularly his actions involving Tiffany. During a routine search of the house, police discovered John's laptop, which contained disturbing evidence. Internet search histories showed extensive research on cyanide, its effects, and how it could be purchased discreetly. The findings were damning, painting a picture of a man who had meticulously planned every aspect of his wife's demise. At this point, Detective Patrick was certain he was dealing with a premeditated murder. The motive, however, remained elusive. Why would John, a man with no prior criminal history, go to such lengths to kill his wife? And what role did his strange fixation on Tiffany play in this horrifying chain of events? Patrick's questions found their answer when a neighbor reported hearing an argument between John and Joan just days before her death. The neighbor claimed she had heard John accuse Joan of getting in the way and ruining everything. These statements, coupled with John's increasingly obsessive behavior toward Tiffany, pointed to a troubling motive. John viewed Joan as an obstacle, a barrier to his obsessive and twisted fixation on Tiffany. The confrontation that followed between Patrick and John was intense. Sitting across from the detective in the small, dimly lit interrogation room, John's previously calm demeanor began to crack. His initial denials turned into defensiveness, and finally, his shoulders slumped as the weight of the evidence closed in around him. After hours of back and forth, John's resolve broke. He confessed to poisoning Joan, admitting that he had seen her as a hindrance to his delusional desire to be closer to Tiffany. John's confession sent shockwaves through Greenhorn. The townsfolk, who had once seen him as a quiet, reserved figure, were horrified by the depth of his deception and cruelty. Joan's death, which had initially seemed like a tragic accident, was revealed to be the result of a carefully calculated betrayal by the man she had trusted with her life. For Tiffany, the discovery was almost unbearable. She had loved her stepfather, or at least respected him as a steady presence in her mother's life. Now, she was forced to grapple with the devastating truth that he had not only taken her mother's life but had done so out of a deranged obsession with her. The betrayal cut deep, leaving her questioning every memory, every interaction she'd ever had with John. As the case moved to trial, Greenhorn found itself divided, grappling with the unfathomable nature of what had happened within one of its most cherished households. Joan's friends and neighbors mourned her loss while grappling with their own feelings of guilt, wondering if they could have somehow prevented this tragedy. But for Tiffany and Detective Patrick, the pain was personal, a reminder of how evil can sometimes hide in the most ordinary of lives. The trial of John Morton became an event that consumed Greenhorn, turning the once tranquil town into a stage for one of the most disturbing cases in recent memory. Reporters arrived in droves, and locals who had once shared friendly waves now avoided eye contact, wary of the dark cloud that seemed to hang over them all. The courthouse, usually reserved for minor civil cases, was packed every day with a mix of curious locals, concerned neighbors, and a few die-hard reporters looking to break a sensational story. Detective Patrick Mallory sat quietly in the back row on the first day, his gaze fixed on John. The confession Patrick had extracted from him still rang in his ears, haunting him at odd hours of the night. He had heard confessions before, but never one as cold, as calculated. Watching John now, dressed in a neatly pressed suit, his face a carefully controlled mask, Patrick couldn't shake the feeling that they were only beginning to understand the full scope of John's twisted mind. The prosecution's case was direct and damning, methodically laying out the evidence. They presented the cyanide-laced Pepsi can, emphasizing how John had intentionally tampered with it, knowing Joan would drink from it. Forensic experts testified about the traces of cyanide on the can's rim, explaining how it would have acted quickly, leaving Joan helpless and without any chance of survival. The jury watched the screens, horrified as they learned about the poison's effects and how John had meticulously researched its acquisition, buying it through obscure channels online. Then came the digital evidence, the search history detailing cyanide's effects, potential delivery methods, and purchase options. The prosecution even brought in a cyberforensic specialist who confirmed that these searches had been conducted exclusively on John's laptop, ruling out any chance of them being an accident or a curiosity. Each piece of evidence painted an unmistakable portrait of premeditation and intent. John's calm demeanor in the courtroom, even when the evidence was irrefutably damning, unnerved the jury and spectators alike. He seemed almost detached, as if he were simply a bystander to his own life, a chilling contrast to the cruelty he had inflicted. Then, Tiffany took the stand. Her presence stirred the room, and as she looked out at the people she had known her entire life, she felt a strange mixture of grief, betrayal, and anger. She recounted discovering her mother's body that morning, her voice breaking as she described the shock, the numbness that had overtaken her. With every word, she painted a picture of Joan's warmth, of her kindness, and how that was taken from her in a single, irreversible moment. She didn't look at John once, refusing to acknowledge him as her stepfather, the man who had lived in her home and shared her family's life. The defense's case rested on arguing that John had suffered a temporary mental break, claiming that his actions were the result of immense psychological stress. His attorney argued that John's mind had been fractured by unaddressed trauma and pent-up anxiety, turning his love for Tiffany into a dangerous fixation. They called a psychologist who testified that John had been under immense stress, driven by feelings of inadequacy and a profound sense of isolation, and that this had manifested in a temporary loss of sanity. They painted him as a man who had simply cracked under pressure, a victim of his own emotional turmoil. But the prosecution wouldn't allow the argument of a temporary break to stand unchallenged. They brought forward testimony from Emily Garrett, who, with tear-streaked eyes, spoke of her affair with John. She described how their relationship had provided him an outlet, a way to escape the pressures he felt. But as their relationship grew, she had noticed his behavior toward Tiffany becoming increasingly unsettling. When she asked him about it, he brushed it off, assuring her that he was simply being a protective father figure. Emily had believed him at first, convinced by his charm and reassurances. Her regret weighed heavily on her, her guilt a palpable presence as she described her eventual realization that John's fixation on Tiffany was anything but fatherly. The prosecution then called on another witness, a former co-worker of John's who described him as a man who wore two faces. At work, John had been cordial and professional, yet there were moments where his anger surfaced, unexpected and frightening. The co-worker recalled instances where John's temper had flared over minor inconveniences, painting a picture of a man who struggled with impulse control, adding to the prosecution's assertion that he had intentionally planned and executed his wife's murder, rather than suffering from a temporary breakdown. As the trial drew to a close, the weight of John's betrayal hung heavy in the air. The townsfolk who had once welcomed him now watched him with a mix of horror and disgust. The prosecution's final statement left an indelible mark on the jury. John Morton had not acted out of temporary insanity but out of a cold, calculated desire to remove his wife from his life. He had viewed Joan as an obstacle, a barrier between himself and his delusional fixation on Tiffany. His actions, they argued, were those of a man who had weighed his options and chosen murder as a means to an end. When the jury retired to deliberate, the entire community held its breath. Hours passed, then days, as the jury meticulously examined the evidence, weighing John's actions against his defense's claims. On the third day, they returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts, including premeditated murder. The sentence was met with silence in the courtroom. John Morton's fate was sealed, but the damage he had inflicted lingered, haunting those he had left behind. For Tiffany, the betrayal was a wound that felt as though it would never heal. She had not only lost her mother but also the stability and trust she had once known. She withdrew from the public eye, turning inward to process the turmoil that had overtaken her life. Some of her friends tried to reach out, but the weight of her grief and betrayal pushed her into isolation, leaving her to grapple with the complex emotions John's actions had stirred. Emily Garrett, too, felt the sting of her choices. She left Greenhorn shortly after the trial, her departure marked by whispers and a collective sense of pity mixed with anger from the townsfolk. Though she hadn't taken part in Joan's death, her role in the affair made her complicit in the community's eyes. She had been Joan's friend, her confidant, and yet she had chosen to betray her. Emily knew she would never fully shake the shadow of that choice, and the guilt was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. In the wake of the trial, Greenhorn struggled to regain its sense of peace. The community came together to honor Joan's memory, establishing a small foundation in her name, focused on supporting women and children in difficult situations. It was a way to keep her legacy alive, to remember the kindness and warmth she had brought to their lives. Yet the town felt forever changed, its innocence tainted by the darkness that had lurked in their midst. Detective Patrick, though hardened by years on the force, found himself deeply affected by the case. He visited Joan's memorial regularly, the memory of her tragic end a reminder of the hidden darkness that sometimes lay behind seemingly perfect lives. Greenhorn continued on, its days marked by the usual rhythms of small-town life, but for those who had known Joan, her absence was a wound that time would struggle to heal. Months after the trial, Greenhorn found itself cautiously settling back into its rhythms. Yet the shadow of Joan's death lingered in the minds of its residents, a haunting reminder that even in the safest of places, darkness could sometimes hide in plain sight. The loss of Joan had cut deep into the fabric of the community, and every small interaction held a weight it hadn't before. As people gathered at the town's small park, their conversations often drifted toward her memory and the sorrowful twists that had shattered their once quiet lives. The memorial foundation set up in Joan's name had become a touchstone for Greenhorn. Located in a small building that had once housed an art studio, the foundation was dedicated to helping local women and families find resources and support in times of crisis. Joan had always believed in the power of healing, whether it came from crystals, herbal teas, or simply an open ear. Now, her memory lived on through the work of volunteers who channeled her compassion into action, making sure that others would not suffer in silence as Joan might have. For Tiffany, the months following the trial were a painful journey through grief, betrayal, and self-discovery. Once a cheerful, curious girl, Tiffany now carried a depth in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The betrayal by John had left her feeling hollow, the pain compounded by the fact that her own family had been the source of her torment. The father figure she had trusted was the same man who had not only taken her mother's life but had also poisoned her sense of safety and trust. She withdrew from friends, rarely venturing out except for school, where she kept her head down, her thoughts distant from the usual teenage chatter. Despite her isolation, Tiffany found solace in art, a passion she had shared with her mother. She started painting in a small studio space at home, turning her memories, fears, and dreams into colors and shapes. At first, the paintings were dark and chaotic, but over time, as she processed her pain, her artwork began to reflect softer tones and a cautious hopefulness. Each brushstroke helped her confront her grief, giving her a way to express the turmoil that words couldn't capture. Slowly, Tiffany felt herself coming back to life, piecing herself together from the fragments left in the wake of John's betrayal. Detective Patrick, too, found himself changed by the case. The image of Joan's still form and the echo of Tiffany's voice as she recounted that morning stayed with him. It was a case that had shaken him, not only because of the betrayal involved but also because of the darkness that had gone unnoticed for so long. In a town where he thought he knew everyone, this case had proven that even the most familiar faces could hide secrets. Haunted by the idea that he might have overlooked signs in the past, Patrick grew more vigilant in his work, more attuned to the subtle cues people gave away. Patrick found himself visiting the foundation frequently, checking in with the volunteers and offering his support. Though he had solved the case, he felt as if his work in honoring Joan's memory wasn't over. He became a quiet supporter, offering advice to the foundation's board, helping organize workshops on community safety, and speaking at events about the importance of vigilance and compassion. He often thought of Joan's shop, her laughter, her warm presence. In the foundation's quiet rooms and bustling events, he felt her spirit, a small comfort that reminded him of why he continued his work despite its burdens. For Emily Garrett, life after the trial was one of constant self-reflection and regret. The affair with John had left her burdened with a sense of guilt that she couldn't shake. She had once been Joan's closest friend, a confidant, and yet she had played a part in the betrayal that had shattered Joan's life. Though she had left Greenhorn shortly after the trial, she couldn't leave behind the guilt that clung to her. She moved to a neighboring town, trying to start anew, but every time she passed a bohemian shop or saw a group of women chatting over coffee, she thought of Joan. In her own attempt at redemption, Emily volunteered with domestic violence support groups, hoping to use her experiences to help others avoid the pitfalls she had fallen into. She knew that no amount of good deeds could erase her betrayal, but she hoped that, in some small way, she could make a difference. It was her way of honoring Joan's memory, a way of atoning for the choices that had led to such tragedy. As the seasons changed, Greenhorn slowly began to heal, though it would never be the same. The town had lost a piece of itself in Joan, a person who had brought light and joy into the lives of everyone she encountered. In her absence, her friends, neighbors, and family were left to pick up the pieces, to find a way forward in a world without her. The Memorial Foundation became a place where her legacy lived on, a constant reminder of her kindness, her belief in healing, and her determination to help those around her. Greenhorn's residents took small comfort in the fact that Joan's life, though cut tragically short, had left a lasting impact. The foundation held annual events in her honor, raising funds, gathering the community, and reminding everyone of Joan's spirit. Her story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in the closest-knit communities, vigilance and compassion were essential. For Tiffany, the foundation served as a place of healing. She eventually volunteered there, her art adorning the walls of the building. She painted vibrant murals that reflected her mother's energy and warmth, filling the space with life and color. Each stroke was a tribute, a way of keeping her mother's spirit alive. As she painted, she felt connected to Joan, felt her presence guiding her. In this way, she began to find a new sense of purpose, a way to carry her mother's memory with her into the future. The years passed, and though the pain of Joan's death remained, it softened, transforming into something more bearable, more endurable. Greenhorn had changed, but it had also grown stronger, finding resilience in the face of tragedy. Joan's story became part of the town's fabric, woven into its collective memory, a somber yet powerful reminder of the importance of compassion, vigilance, and the strength of community. As for Detective Patrick, he continued his work with a renewed sense of purpose. Joan's case had reminded him of the fragility of life and the importance of justice. He carried her memory with him, her smile, her kindness, and her tragic end a constant reminder of why he had chosen this path. Greenhorn might never return to the innocence it once knew, but through the resilience of those who remained, Joan's legacy lived on, a light that continued to guide them through even the darkest of times.